Hi, everyone. Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. It is close to evening, Monday, June 24th, 2024, the 18th day of Sivan, 5784. Hot here in the land in many different ways. So I know that this show goes into a whole lot of different places, and last week we went to Sweden. This week we're staying close to home, to Jerusalem. And I'm very honored to have as my guest Rabbi David Fuld, who will start off telling us a little bit about his background and then really get into, well, I don't know if it's his life's work, he will tell us, but it's definitely other people's lives that he holds so dear. So Rabbi Fuld, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
From
Good
Jerusalem.
evening.
So a little bit, your English is excellent. So a little bit about your background before you moved to the Holy Land.
I grew up in Manhattan, where diction counted.
Yes. And then Smicha?
Ultimately, I married a gorgeous gal from Brooklyn, and my English was compromised.
Yeah. That's for sure. I'm from Los Angeles, so I like making fun of people from New York. But to tell, I mean, my listeners can't see because they're listening and they can't see the audio. But behind you are beautiful shelves of different Gemaras, I would imagine, and different texts relating to Judaism. And you are a rabbi. So did you start off as a pulpit rabbi, or how did this?
I'm a mile. I'm a mile.
So for those who don't. So for those who don't know, because we have listeners, Christian and Jewish listeners, well, I imagine a lot of people know now, that is the one who circumcises 8-day-old boys and brings them into the Jewish people, the Brit, the covenant with God. So that's your specialty?
That's what I trained as, and that was the profession that I had as my love my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
But as a descendant of German Jews never accepted fees for bris milah. Right. So we all had something else going for us, either an avocation or a business or a vocation. We functioned as Rabbi Mohalim strictly on a not-for-payment process.
Okay, it's a very important thing to do. Okay, so what did you do in order to be able to give you the freedom? What is the number, 13,000?
13,200.
Unbelievable. 13,000.
A nice career. It's 58 years. It's a lot of years. Wow. So it doesn't translate into that much. And when I was a little boy, when we hit 6th or 7th grade, I'm not sure, Russia launched Sputnik. It was devastating to America. Russia had lapped us, had gotten ahead of us on the science program. The principal of Manhattan Day School, where I attended, had the foresight to begin a general science program. I think the only yeshiva Ketana that had that. I remember we had science fairs. I remember I had a project with a young man who went on to become a major Rosh Yeshiva in Rosh Kollel, and where we took goldfish out of a pail, wrapped them in wet cotton, laid them on a petri dish, and put their tails under a microscope to demonstrate the corpuscles or the blood cells tramping through capillaries one by one in line. Wow. So the interest in sciences in a halachic framework began real early, thanks to this Dr. Axelrod, who was our principal, the one who really had the foresight to make those programs. I went on. I once wanted very badly to be a doctor. Getting accepted to medical school didn't help me. My father became ill, and I was getting ready to get married, and I didn't see myself living off my father at that point. Mm-hmm. And I became a mile, happily. It's a very antidepressant kind of profession. You get up every morning and you have a simcha. Right. In front of you is a healthy baby. Everybody's smiling and yelling mazel tov. No matter how tough your day is going to be, mm-hmm. You begin someplace up on top. Mm-hmm. And I enjoyed that career very much. It carried me more than I carried it. Along the route, if you want to go to PGD, we had a child. I was in the delivery room with my wife, and she came out with an abdomen full of stains. They're called today cafe au lait stains. And I said to the obstetrician, who was a very skilled, intelligent obstetrician, "What is that?" He said, "Oh, it's nothing, it's birthmarks." And I said, "Dr. Murray, that's not birthmarks. I've done thousands of babies' births. I never saw that." At any rate, I spent the next 5 years going from doctor to doctor, dermatologist to dermatologist, until someone identified it as cafe au lait stains that was then called von Recklinghausen disease. It's a very ugly disease. Today it's referred to as neurofibromatosis 1. It involves all of the nerves in the body. They all grow little tumors. So if it's on the optic nerve, you're blind. If it's on the audio or the acoustical nerve, you're deaf. The spine, it's scoliosis. The brain, you're retarded. It affects everything that nerves support in the body. From then on, I traveled the world speaking to the experts on von Recklinghausen, which became NF1, neurofibromatosis. The leading research in the United States for neurofibromatosis was in Baylor in Texas. His name was Vince Riccardi, a lovely, lovely man. And I have to tell you that I spent a lot of time with him collaborating on how to go forward with my daughter. Traveled all over Europe, saw every genetics center in the world. In fact, I remember once telling my wife, "I want to call Dr. So-and-so at Harvard," and she said, "He doesn't know who you are." And I called him up. He was an Oriental physician. And he said in a heavy Oriental accent, "Oh, you're the rabbi from Queens." I was known by all these centers, kind of such a nutnik. I had to find out what we could do. The end, let me jump to the end, is that thank God she has none of the manifestation of that disease. She only has dermatological manifestation. And today she's half a century old with 4 kids and everybody's healthy as well.
Wow.
So I always took the attitude that Kadosh Baruch Hu cut me slack. That favor he did for me. And I had difficulty talking about our family's experiences till we were far out of the clouds. I felt I had to pay back. I had looked into and uncovered a new technique that was developed in reproductive medicine called PGD, or Preimplantation Genetic Diagnosis. It existed in Denver and in Chicago. Those were the two chalutzim, the two people who carved the first furrows in the earth with this technique. What it does is it makes a gal, like an IVF, mature 24 eggs in a cycle. And those are all pulled by a suction biopsy. They're fertilized with the father's sperm, and then either a polar body, a little appendage that is developed in the first hours, or you wait till it develops into a blastocyst, 8 cells, and 1 cell is taken out, and you evaluate whether that mutation is present or not. As you remember from high school biology with mitosis and meiosis,
yes.
Everything's a pair, and the kid gets half a pair of daddy and half a pair of mommy. So statistically, half those ova should be devoid of that disease.
Right.
So if you pick the good ones and chuck the not good ones, you'll have healthy kids.
Unless both the parents are recessive for that gene. And
now, if they're both recessive, they both have a good gene and a bad gene.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get, in that case, statistically, which means for 100,000 children,
right,
not each case, you'll get 1 that's affected, 2 that are carriers,
right,
and 1 that's completely clear.
Right.
So we're going to use that embryo that's the 4th that's completely clear.
Okay.
And end up with healthy kids. It's a very marvelous breakthrough. It's allowed us to eradicate tons of disease, and with that, many, many tons of suffering and pain and heartache. If you think every child has a mommy and daddy, that's three folk, and a bunch of siblings whose lives are deranged by the birth of a very affected child, and countless uncles and aunts and neighbors, a lot of suffering and pain goes into these diseases.
All right, so a few questions that come up. One, of course, and being that you're a rabbi, is what we would say in Hebrew or in Judaism, halachic questions, meaning the questions that how this fits into Jewish law is I mean, obviously it's allowed or you wouldn't be doing it. So I'd like to, if you could explain, because some of my listeners are Jews, some are Christians, some are Muslims. Every religion has their own ideas, abortion, what entails abortion, how does this fit? So if you could take a few minutes, because I think that's a super important component of what you're doing here, to explain to my listeners how this works.
So first of all, let me tell you up front, not to be arrogant, but I didn't rely on my genius. I went to Gedolei Israel, the leading decisor of Jewish law in our generation.
Mm-hmm.
Went to Rabbi Yoshev. I went to Moshe Halberstam, who is the posek or the decisive for the tragedies, the most radical that we have in Jerusalem. I went to Rav Wosner Zatzal. Went to all Gedolei Israel that we could access, and everyone was very encouraging. Everyone. For a Catholic, where life begins at conception, this is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not Catholic.
Right.
Our life does not begin at conception. And I need to tell you that statistically, of 6 ova that are fertilized, only 1 implants and makes a pregnancy. So when you have a fertilized ova in your hand, anybody in Las Vegas can tell you the odds are against you. Judaism deals with an external ova fertilized an embryo as having no status whatsoever. It has the potential of creating a child, an embryo, and for that, certain laxity and permissions are given if the freezer goes off on Shabbat. But otherwise, they have no status and no standing. It's considered part of the fluids of a mother's uterus. Later on, he's considered as an organ in his mother's body.
Mm-hmm.
So we have no problem with discarding defective embryos or using them for research.
Mm-hmm. Well.
There are people who talk and have to say we might not be allowed to do it, and some with a beard and a frock. But you know, Albert Einstein said 2 things are infinite: the universe and stupidity, and he said, I'm not sure about the universe. So people can say what they want.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean they're not stupid. Absolutely. Persons who have genetic defects and don't go for PGD, for this technique, are doing something criminal, and they'll answer very badly to God. While they might be shogegim, innocent by virtue of not knowing, in establishing a pregnancy, they're mezidim or premeditated on being stupid. You're obliged to acquire a certain amount of knowledge. And if there's a genetic defect, you have a laptop, you have access to entire medical school libraries, you ought to find out what your options are and make inquiries amongst the experts of this planet.
So, but what you're doing here is assuming that people have done the genetic testing.
If they haven't, you know, I would consider that criminal.
Okay. So everybody, when they get married or decide to start a family, needs to do whatever tests are available.
Right. There's a J screen system in America. Here in Israel, it goes through the Kupot.
Okay.
J screen is very competent, and they should be used.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I know also because my family we're Ashkenazi Jewry, that the Ashkenazi, meaning the Jews who spent a whole lot of years up in what we would now call Europe, have certain genetic diseases, Tay-Sachs, breast cancer, because of it marrying within the communities, and so certain genes didn't get weeded out. You work, I imagine it's a good part of your work, but what other populations have certain things that keep showing up over and over? One of my daughters actually married a boy whose mother is from Morocco and his father's from Tunisia. And in terms of genetics, we thought that was he's a great guy also.
Pretty safe.
But and the kid's adorable. But in addition to that, what we're seeing here specifically in Israel, which is a mixing of Jews coming from different parts of the planet, is perhaps lowering some of the chances, diluting the gene pool, if you will, in certain areas.
Absolutely, because as you said, when you have recessive genes, if it's a typical European disorder, it won't be typical for the Mediterranean.
Right.
One shouldn't rely on that. And there are screens to be done for Ashkenazim of 160 to 240 different mutations. Wow. And there's screens, it's one blood test, or even very often it's just a swab in the cheek.
No, I'm just amazed at how many genetic diseases
and
there are.
What do you call it? There for the Sephardic world as well, there's a different set of screens. I think absolutely every parent should guide their children for their weddings to be screened. There are loads of things that we ignore in society. Every girl should be given folic acid 3 months before her wedding. Right. We don't notice that. Everybody should be using salt that has iodine in it if you keep kosher. The non-kosher, non-Jewish neighbors of ours have seafood where they get iodine.
Right.
We have no real source. So there are things that you need to know to act as responsible parents and guide your children through the shoals of life. One of them is genetic studies, and they must be done. Not to do it is criminal.
You would recommend that for non-Jews as well? I mean, right? There are
absolutely.
Yeah, everybody's got something in their
absolutely
background. Mm-hmm.
No, genetic disease, we have a unique genetic disposition because we married our own.
Right.
Everyone should be screened.
So I remember hearing years ago, because when I first got married, this week it's going to be 43 years, there were very few, there was there were really maybe just half a dozen.
May I interrupt you?
Please.
43 years is just the beginning. I'm married 56 years, and it feels just like 2 days.
Oh, amazing. It should be
Yom
that.
Kippur, Shabbat.
It should be that. And you haven't had such an easy time. So
I said Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av.
Oh, that's what you said. To those 2 days. Most
just
difficult
joking.
Days in the Jewish calendar. Yes, I know you're joking.
The biggest achievement I have is that I convinced my wife to marry me. So I was just joking.
Yes. When maybe she just won't listen to this podcast, and then all will be well in her house. we won't get you into too much trouble. But when I first got married, the testing was just for a couple of things, and that was it. And in the intervening
no genetic
years,
testing 43 years ago.
Yeah.
And none.
I think it wasn't even for Tay-Sachs. I was thinking maybe that.
I think it came later.
But I remember that people didn't want to get tested because if you really loved somebody, you preferred not to know. Like, what if we're a bad match in terms of the children we're going to have, but I really love them. So we're just going to hope and pray. But what you're doing here is saying that it's not an impediment to getting married.
Not at all. Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't go into the discussion of what happens to a young couple. And I'm talking about the non-Haredi world, where they've dated and fallen in love, and you separate them. I think if you revisit most of those couples 20 years later, you're going to meet 4 adulterers.
Yeah.
So I think one should be careful in coming to halachic conclusions without speaking to more important people. I had this conversation with Steinerman Zatzal regarding a couple that the girl's parents wanted to break up. And when I said to him, I'm scared that we'll come back and find 4 adulterers in 20 years,
right.
He agreed wholeheartedly. And he suggested that they get married sooner.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And do this.
And he was enthusiastic about our lab. I didn't mention him earlier. He was very enthusiastic about the lab.
All right. So let's talk about the lab, which is
one more thing.
Sure.
One of the major decisors of this generation is Rav Osher Weiss Shlita. And he wrote a very, very beautiful, didactic, an absolute responsa that doing PGD is a very noble, good thing halachically.
Wow.
It's a published tshuva.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Look, we live in a society here in Israel, and I know that this is going to sound a bit cynical, but we have socialized medicine here. So when someone has a child with something wrong with it, and it can happen even under the, trying everything, society ends up also paying for that and for the care of that child. So there's a bigger picture here when you live in a country that also does that. It's not just a personal decision. So maybe I'll have a child with something wrong with it, but I'll pay for the care for however long they are alive.
Don't feel bad. That whole talk is irrelevant to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a capitalist only. I don't believe in socialized anything. I think everything that's socialized is half stupid and half incompetent. I can tell you in my lab, and you understand the costs of child with cystic fibrosis.
Right.
Just the parking fees to bring this kid to the hospital every time he gets in trouble will cost more than to do PGD to make sure he would be born healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, it was a question with the Sala Briut, the basket of health. I begged them not to fund it. So the government should stay out of it and have no part of it. Today, the Sala Briut in Israel, the basket of health, and you can be real proud of this, pays for 2 children per family.
Right.
There is no country in the world, planet Earth, has no one that is as generous and as kind and as giving as the state of Israel vis-a-vis these genetic diseases.
Right. Or anybody who's having fertility issues, the government
Of course,
will pay
the
for
argument,
repeated.
why number 3, 4, and 5 you're not worried about.
Mm-hmm.
So with God's help, my good wife Anita and I have covered the costs of kids number 3 up to 19th. I said a maximum at 19.
19. Okay. So tell us about the lab. How did it start? When? Where?
I went to one of the progenitors of PGD, Dr. Yuri Verlinsky in Chicago. He's a guy who couldn't get into medical school in Russia because he was a Jew. And he became a PhD geneticist. And he developed this technique of polar body dissection for preimplantation genetic diagnosis. And after I really became pretty knowledgeable or pretty familiar with what was going on, I flew out to him and I said to Verlinsky, how come you have an office like this? He had a magnificent ceiling 2 stories high, a mahogany walled, beautifully furnished office. I said, you're a communist. How come you live like this? I don't have an office like this. So let me tell you about America. In America, everyone buys life insurance for when things go bad. If you're right and everything they taught in Russia is correct and there's no God, I blew most of my life better than 85%. But if I'm right and there is a God, you're going to go to hell. So why don't you negotiate with me? We'll open a lab in the state of Israel. I'll facilitate it. I'll fund it. And you'll provide the training for the staff from the physicians and the embryologists down to the technicians and nurses. You get a staff trained to your standard. And I promise you, when you come to the next world and you get shocked and you say, holy mackerel, there's the Malach Gavriel. There is a God. You're going to understand that you're protected. And he went for that. And then we came to Israel, and I needed 3 things in the hospital we would rest or park our cars in. One is we needed excellent fertility medicine. And by the way, Shaarei Tzedek just now got rated number 1 in Israel in terms of live births for IVF attempts. We needed excellent genetics. Shaarei Tzedek's chief of genetics is the young lady who identified the BRCA genes for all of society. Wow. She and Mary Claire King in Chicago, she being, excuse me, she being, you have to excuse me one moment.
That's fine.
She being Efrat Levi Lahad, She and Mary Clicking collaborated and identified those two genes. And I absolutely needed a place where halacha would reign supreme, where we wouldn't do things that are halachically reprehensible. Traveled to many hospitals. The only one I could find was Shaarei Tzedek. There are other wonderful hospitals in Israel.
Right.
And other observant hospitals in Israel.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a few right now. Yes.
But none of them had the fertility medicine nor the genetics that would go with halacha. And the other ones that had it didn't have the halachic aspect.
Okay.
So choice was yes or no.
The triple crown with Shaarei Tzedek. Right.
That was it. That was the only option we had. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they were very skeptical about it. Very skeptical. And they went along enthusiastically after they yielded that skepticism. And they've developed a department. We're really a world-class place. If you lived in New York and you needed this care, you'd be foolish not to get on an airplane and come here. We're probably the largest, most reliable lab in the world today.
Wow.
With a margin of error of zero.
Of zero?
Zero.
Wow.
That's where you a diagnosis and it's a false negative, meaning you say it's okay and it ain't.
Huh.
They're doing a pretty marvelous job. First of all, it's also a very lovely, nice, hospitable place. But they're brilliant people, conscientious, and we're proud to have to do with them.
So when did this all begin?
About 19 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Amazing.
First child was en route after 19 years, showed up 18 years ago. His family has dystonia, neuromuscular defect. I got a call one night that this kid had been born. They would like to invite me. Would I come to Israel to do the bris? So, of course, my wife and I went the next plane. That was the question. They were up all night, the staff, to corroborate his blood tests with the physical diagnosis, looking at the guy to make sure that indeed he was healthy, which he was. The bris was in a large hall. The whole family was there. It looked like the most horrendous sight you've ever seen. It's a dominant defect. Everyone in the family had it.
Oh, my God.
There were wheelchairs and crutches and walkers. You walked in there, it looked like the parking lot of Yad Sarah. Mm-hmm. Horrendous. And here's a gorgeous, healthy child.
Who will have, please God, healthy children.
Yep. We picked a flower out of God's garden while he was looking. It was an incredible bris. All the important folk from Shaarei Tzedek were there. It was a very choking, beautiful reality. I was in a restaurant with my wife, and they came over to visit me. The father said, "You don't recognize me?" And I said, "No, I don't." And that was the father of this child. And he told me he's making a bar mitzvah for this child.
Wow.
Where could he send an invitation? Would I come? And then he went on to tell me that he just picked up this kid from basketball practice. I guarantee you the last 10 generations, no one in that family played basketball. It's just a exhilarating reality. I remember that bar mitzvah, which was a bunch of years ago. I told this kid, I'm always bothered by birthday parties. What did you do? What did you do? You didn't die for the last year? It's your mother who did. She carried you. She went into labor and delivery. She stayed up every night feeding you. She worried when the town bully bothered you. She was there for you all the time. On your birthday, send your mother flowers. And I think that's a proper approach. I told this guy, you don't know what your mommy went through to make you a healthy, gorgeous kid that you are. Make sure you send her those flowers.
Really? I love that. I'm going to mention that to my kids. Like, subtly. Yeah, I think that's just
incredible. incredible.
They'll think it's incredible.
They'll think it's a manifestation of your being blonde.
Shh, my listeners don't know. So when did you decide that you needed to be closer to the lab and move to Israel?
Chibas was always here.
Mm-hmm.
About 40 years, I'm coming every month. Um, we were brought up with an intense sense of a love for Zion, all of us. And I hope I got that into most of my kids, if not all of them.
Mm-hmm.
One lives here, one built a beautiful home, spends a bunch of the year here. One bought a piece of land now in Givot Eden and is waiting for approvals to begin building.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, we'll get them all here. I have 2 weddings coming of grandchildren. They'll be here. They're done. They're living here.
I assume they're doing the genetic testing. The wedding.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I think you have to be completely out of your mind not to. I really don't even begin to understand. But then again, you know what? I might not be the most tolerant person you've interviewed. I don't understand how a mother risks not giving her child immunizations. But there are a lot of people who do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think their children should be taken away from them. How's that for an awful position?
Look,
I don't think you have right to do that.
Yeah.
You're not old enough. I am. I remember polio, and I remember rubella. I remember a beautiful, beautiful funeral when I was a tiny little kid, pulling up in front of our house, a big Cadillac, but a tiny, tiny, tiny casket. And behind it was a big flower truck. The family was Catholic, with the most magnificent wreaths you could imagine. And that kid died of pertussis. You don't even know what pertussis is in your generation.
Whooping cough, yes.
Yeah, but did you ever see what that looks like? Go on YouTube and see suffering.
Mm-hmm.
I remember fracturing my elbow and spending the night in Roosevelt Hospital. The bed next to me was a young boy in an iron lung. He had polio. Yeah. These things didn't disappear because people said to heal him. These things disappeared because of the development of these immunizations. I don't think parents have the prerogative to do whatever they want. They can't flog their kids, can't starve their kids, and I don't think you can withhold proper medical care. And genetic screening is proper medical care today.
Do you yourself try and convince people to do it, or it's like if you don't understand it, you don't?
But I don't. Whoever speaks to me, certainly I'll spend the time trying to convince them, but I won't stand on street corners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But do you work with rabbis or other leaders of different communities to have them, impart the importance to their communities? Like when people come for premarital counseling, or I'm just thinking of different organizations here. For example, one of my daughters works with Zohar. They do they sit with the bride, actually with the bride and the groom before the wedding, and explain to them a lot about the intricacies of marriage and the intimacies of marriage. And these are people who are right there at that exact time period who
and she come
might
help
be
me
able
out
to say something. I'll ask her. She just had, okay. She has it. Yes.
I haven't found a rabbinic group that does this with whom I'm comfortable. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, that's why I'm asking.
I have a problem with the main genetic testing group. Don't say names. No. That's rabbinic. And they did an awful lot of holy work with getting rid of Tay-Sachs from our tent. But for example, today, when they test someone, they generally do only 14 syndromes instead of 160 or 180. And they don't test for Gaucher, which is the most common Ashkenazi disorder.
Right.
So when a gal gets told by a pediatrician this kid is suffering from Gaucher, can't walk back those symptoms. They're not reversible. They could have been avoided just by giving him an enzyme shot. And they decided not to test. How dare they make such a decision? So I'm kind of comfortable that this is a function of education, and we should be educating our kids in high school and in graduate school and everything in between, that they should understand how to function in life.
Mm-hmm. No, it should be part and parcel, I think, of any kind of premarital discussion or preparation.
But I got to tell you also, an area of the biggest failure of my efforts in my lab is that most people never heard of PGD, which is why I enthusiastically agreed to spend this time with you.
And I appreciate it.
Just one woman hears it, and one woman realizes she can avoid suffering and death. Forget about expense. It's all worth it, but it ain't out there.
Right.
It's just not out there. And I don't know why. You know what? I'll tell you a great story. During COVID, Purim showed up and I had to go to Megillah reading. So the chief of Shaarei Tzedek, the Mankal, invited me where he lanes Megillah to go to a major philanthropist's home. And we went. There were 11 people there for a minyan. We heard Megillah. At the end of Megillah, I get introduced to a guy who just came in after we finished reading. He chiefs a department in Israel in a hospital for cystic fibrosis, an ugly disease.
Yes, it was in my family.
It's a lot of suffering. He never heard of PGD. And I almost fell over. And I kind of pinched my wife's arm because I had to get out of there because he didn't want me to tell him what I thought of it. How was he not keeping up with the literature? How did he not know about PGD? Or was he perpetuating his department and his employment by letting the disease continue?
Oh,
I didn't know with it. And that's what Einstein said, two things are infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you speak to your obstetrician or your kid's pediatrician, the odds are not in favor that they heard of PGD. And by the way, in Israel, it's heard of much more than in America. You'd be shocked in America, shocked.
Well, it should be part of the curriculum in medical school. I mean, every doctor should know about this. Okay, we started here.
No argument.
One last question. You treat people irrespective of nationality, race, obviously sex. It's going to have to be the women who are having the babies still, despite other people.
That I'm not going to join you, but of course there's an area of what are you doing? It's two women.
Okay, we could leave that for a different conversation.
But I got to tell you, because you don't know much about me, I was a male captive in a female body. And then my mother gave birth to me. It's an important part of my background.
I would imagine. Yes, but
that are difficult to deal with. But yes, we treat everyone. In fact, this Dr. Riccardi that I told you about, the expert on neurofibromatosis research, called me. He had a prince from Saudi Arabia with an F1. Would we treat? So I said, of course we would. Saudi Arabia has been friendly and pleasant with Israel. I have no problem with them.
Look, what you spoke about, how Israel pays for up to 2 children and fertility treatments, that's any Israeli. Christians, Muslims, Jews, right. Anybody. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're not at war so much with the Christians,
Yes, at least not now. Right. That was in the past. I'm glad that's over.
But I can't go that far back. At the end of the day, things do change and they get better sometimes. That got better.
Yes.
But the hospital's policy is a very liberal policy of treat everyone.
Okay. You hear that, everybody, all my listeners? You shouldn't have any genetic diseases, but if you do, now you know where to go. We talk about like the light coming out of Zion, and it's much bigger than people think. And I think what you're doing is one of those things. I don't think it's just happenstance that this is happening in Jerusalem, and can change so many people around the world, can save them from so much grief. It's a beautiful thing.
I did a bris for a Bukharian young couple. That's an area of Russia, or of the USSR at the time. 18 months later, they called me back for a second baby. And as I left their home, I said, please call me next year in good health. If it's a girl, I want to tell you Mazel Tov.
Right.
I said countless times. And the father choked. And he said, we're not going to have any more children. So I said, why are you talking like that? He said, my 18-month-old, was just diagnosed. He has a genetic form of blindness. And he's going blind while in our arms. So I didn't say anything. Half a year later, I asked him to come to my home, told him about PGD, told him I can guarantee him absolutely that the next baby produced will be without that defect. And he came to Jerusalem. While he was here, by the way, he talked about his smoking. Meanwhile, they had a gorgeous little girl. They named that girl in my wife's honor in her name.
Oh, how beautiful.
And they went back to New York. They had a better shot coming here than dealing there. It's many years ago. New York today has some PGD and has some good PGD as well.
Mm-hmm.
But their lives would change dramatically. There are people with that same form of blindness or deafness or propensity to disease that will just ignore it, not do PGD, and end up making sick kids. So we need to send flowers on birthdays to our mothers.
Gotcha. Rabbi David Fuld, thank you so much for everything you've done and for everything you will do, and for every child that is going to be born healthy due to your perseverance and your stubbornness on this issue. And let's just hope that more people hear about it and it goes further
Today
afield.
we have an awful lot of babies beyond the ability to count.
Incredible.
We're probably approaching 10,000 kids.
Unbelievable.
That's a big number. That's 20,000 parents, right. Countless siblings. It's a lot of misery erased.
Yes, it is. It is. So, wow, I'm really overwhelmed. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show today. And
it was my pleasure.
Really. And Michaya L'chaya, with everything, with the difficulties that we're having here in Israel right now, and the heartache and the inhumanity that surrounds us from all sides, it's important to focus on what you hold important and what we all hold important, which is bring life and bring healthy life. And that's what we're going to continue to do. Thank you so much. Harow Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Thank you so much, Rabbi Fuld, and thank you everyone for listening. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.